Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Cheyenne Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Cheyenne Hills at CheyenneHills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. And Nathan, here we are a few days after Independence Day, and yet I think we both have a whole lot to say. Our hearts are full of, we just had a service this weekend. We featured three different retired military, and I asked them the question, what kind of impact did the founders have on your service, if at all?
Right.
And so it spawned so much conversation. We actually, before we did this, we sat around the table at a restaurant, and I just was brainstorming. I just thought, what could possibly happen here, and I could tell pretty quick that each guy could easily fill 30 minutes on their own.
That's great. They're great guys too.
Oh my gosh! Yeah. So do you know all of them?
I don't
know personally. Okay, Steve Zerwinski, retired military, Air Force. 30-some years, 33, I think, years.
Wow.
And then Glenn McAllister, retired Air Force, and I actually was at his retirement. Just a phenomenal guy. Just unbelievable what he's accomplished over his years. 24 years. And then Andy Warshak, who's retired Navy, he was on a nuclear sub. And each one of these guys now serves, in the parking lot or in the children's area or backstage.
That's tremendous.
Just servants.
Yeah.
The most humbling thing about these guys, now that I know more of what they aspired to, was their humility.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, that's very founder-like.
Yes.
Because the men that drafted this Constitution and the men that risked their lives in sacred honor for this country were pretty humble guys. They're farmers. They were just humble guys.
So 33 years in the military, that's highly accomplished.
Oh my gosh.
That's amazing. And yet you're right. It's just like our founders, men who were highly accomplished.
Yes.
And yet sought to serve others.
Very articulate.
They defined public servant.
Yep, exactly.
Love that.
Yeah, and so one of the key things, and I want to kind of kick our time off, because I'd like for us to just, stretch out Independence Day. This is like, my wife, she'll tell me, well, this is birthday week, so we have to celebrate a whole week.
I love that idea.
Yeah, no, it's
good.
It's stretching even to almost 2 weeks now.
Yes.
We kind of celebrate both sides of it. But anyway, I'm kidding her a little bit, but. So this is Independence Week. We're still in independence mode.
I'm
here.
good with that.
Yeah, I'm too. But this is a quote from Ronald Reagan, and this came out during our roundtable discussion at the restaurant, and that this is really the heart, and I think it's my heart for our talk today. It's not so much to remember all those things, although it's important, but it's really to impact the next generation, because these truths aren't getting to people in the next generation the degree and to the relevance that I think is necessary. So this is our attempt. This is from Ronald Reagan. He says this: freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We don't pass it to our children in bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States when men were free. Wow. And
That's deep.
we're looking right directly at that very thing. There's freedoms that are being either taken or discussed about taken away that are we need to wake up to.
That's right.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill made the statement, of course, many years before that even, but he talked about we have the opportunity to lift only one link in the chain of history at a time.
Okay.
And it's our duty to lift our link when it's our time, to ensure that it doesn't fall apart in our hands. And that is the kind of the challenge, the conundrum that previous generations have seen, but I feel like our generation is failing at. Yeah. And I'm so thankful, though, as people are beginning to recognize the problem, that more and more people are joining the chorus of saying, listen, no, I'm gonna do my duty. I'm gonna lift my link. I'm gonna pass on to the next generation what I've learned from the previous generation.
Do you have a? This is off topic a little bit. Why?
Yeah.
Why is it that I don't know, generations in the past felt that responsibility, and why are we losing it, or why has it had been lost?
Well, I think that's a complex question, and I'll offer a couple of possibilities, but there are probably many, many more. In the 3rd century, Juvenal, a historian of ancient Rome, so he was writing back about the Roman Republic,
Okay.
and he made the mention. The phrase was panem et circuses, but what he was talking about, he said, Rome was specifically lulled to sleep by bread and circuses.
Oh, wow.
In our culture today, we find people talking primarily not about principles and ideals, but the latest amusement, the
Yes.
latest TV show or whatever it may be.
That's for sure.
Just to repeat, amusement, to muse means to think, to ponder. When you put the prefix "ah" in front of muse, it means to not.
To not ponder.
Right. That's Greek.
Oh my gosh.
I think
I
that,
never put those two together before.
Right.
Yeah.
Our pursuit of amusement has created a culture of not thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think that would be one potential thing.
Yeah.
The second as well is previous generations, coming, for instance, out of World War II,
Yeah.
where we lost hundreds of thousands of lives. There are 4,400 and something stars on the World War II memorial off of the National Mall in Washington, D.C.
That's a lot of families impacted.
Every one of those,
sure.
though, actually stands for 100 families
Is that
impacted.
right? Oh my gosh.
When you think about that,
Yeah.
and my granddaddy almost lost his life in the Pacific in World War II. In Okinawa, he got so sick. He had seen a lot of action and everything, but he got so sick from malaria. They took him back to Hawaii, and he was in that, I forget the name of that pink hospital there, but he was there for almost a month. They thought they were going to lose him.
Wow.
And you look at people touched by that over and over and over again.
Yeah.
In our generation today, though, most people think about the amusements than they do the cost of freedom.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
I just in a podcast recently, I was talking with actually with Julie, and we were talking about one of the things that impacted me. She talked about what impacted her was 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah.
impacted me was in my high school years. My uncle Delmer served in World War II, and so he would have been my grandfather's. He'd been great uncle, so my grandfather's brother. So a couple of generations before, served in World War II. And anytime anything would come up about, I don't know, socialism or anything in the political world, or if he smelled any of it, he would speak to what he saw, because he was on a ship. They landed, I think, in St. Petersburg, and they spent some time in Russia. And he talked about these things. He said, these are the things that, you stay completely clear of, because he saw it, and he talked about the hopelessness, the lack of motive, the lack of incentive to work, and to all those things. It was like a constant lecture that I remember.
That's powerful.
Yeah, we farmed on the opposite side of the roads, but we had a shop and a kind of a coffee shop, if you will, kind of a place to kind of hang out in the mornings and kind of talk about the day and whatnot. But those talks with Uncle Delmer stuck with me for sure, and that really what kind of started my understanding and a context of some of the things that have to be passed down.
That's right.
He passed it down to the next generation. But one of the try to answer that question for me personally, a couple of weeks ago, I had a sermon. I talked about my grandmother who had gone. She was born during World War I. She was married during the Great Depression. No, she was during the Dust Bowl years in 35. Yeah. She went through the Great Depression in 29, then married in 35, and then had her son, my dad, in 41, which is in the middle of World War II. And to start a family and those people knew sacrifice.
They did.
And I wonder that hardship and that sacrifice. I just wonder if that somehow, I know it did. It welded something in them that made them really, really sturdy people.
They had the absence of bread and circuses.
Yeah.
They were forced by the reality of life to to work.
They had to, survival.
But they also became strong, and that's the generation that primarily carried us through the Cold War.
Yeah.
And a wonderful generation. That doesn't mean that they didn't have their faults, but at the same time, because of that adversity, something powerful came.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the Independence Day and the legacy that we have that comes out of that, I think that we find the same sort of things.
I agree, and I think a lot of the policies and the ideas, and we were talking earlier about the founding fathers, and even those were born out of difficult circumstances, or they saw it or lived through it in England or in Europe somewhere,
Right.
and they said, "Okay, we don't want this.
Right.
So whatever we do, it's gonna look different."
That's right.
You were talking about even some of our founding fathers, but it went back to John Locke. You want to retrace that story, because that's
So
fascinating.
let's, if you don't mind, what we'll do is when we talk about the signing of the Declaration of Independence,
Okay.
we go back to June the 7th. Richard Henry Lee of 1776. June the 7th, Richard Henry Lee made a statement that was copied almost verbatim from what he had received from his home state of Virginia, which was a statement that says that the colonies, that these states are and of a right ought to be free and independent states.
Okay.
Now that right there was a declaration against the most powerful empire on the earth at the time.
Right.
I mean, that is a deadly statement. And yet when he made that statement, the people in general in the Constitutional Congress, they agreed, the Continental Congress. So on June the 10th, they actually put together 5 men to go look at what they were going to say in this declaration of their independence. And of course, Thomas Jefferson is most famous among them, but it was headed by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams.
Okay.
And so Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Rutherford and a pastor from Rhode Island, whose name I'm forgetting right now.
How do you forget the pastors?
I
You can't
know,
do that.
it's terrible. and they got together, and actually Jefferson was tasked with writing the main portion of the document.
Okay.
The rest of them essentially served as an editing committee.
Okay.
But Jefferson, he waited a long time before he wrote anything. Supposedly, I read one place that he basically wrote it all within a day. So about 15 days, he was sitting there pondering, what do you write when you make a statement that is so profound?
Yeah.
And I love it, when he talked about how he made the declaration of our rights, but he made it a universal declaration that we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And then he goes on to enumerate a few of them. But I love that statement is not something that was created in a vacuum. Some modern historians will say, well, he was just quoting John Locke. John Locke did talk about unalienable rights. But he also said that these were unalienable rights, life, liberty, and property.
Okay.
But we know property is not an unalienable right. It is very important. It is a right when you own it, but you can alienate yourself from it. You can sell it to someone else.
Sure.
The moment you sell it, you have no right to that property. But what was so neat, and the way Jefferson phrased all this, is it came through what became known as the Scottish Enlightenment, common sense realism. And so what they did is they in general agreed with Locke, but they began to discuss what are unalienable rights.
Okay.
And so property, they said, is an important right, but it isn't in the same
Not
level
inalienable.
of life and liberty.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So what they said, they began the discussion of what is an alienable and an inalienable right, and what importance do they hold. And it came through decades of brilliant men, Lord Keynes and Thomas Reed and Adam Smith and others talking about these ideas. Well, one man, a man by the name of David Hume, who is very important to our founders as well, he said, well, we don't really know what those inalienable rights are because we can't understand what every culture is thinking at the same time. They may have a different understanding of a right than we do, and so on. Well, Thomas Reed took umbrage at that. He said, no, I don't care what culture you go to. There are certain things that there is a sense, and he introduced this phrase, there's a sense that people hold in common, and he called it common sense.
Oh, darn.
And he said this common sense, which he borrowed from Aristotle and Cicero, sensus communis, common sense.
Okay.
But he said we understand these things because in every culture, these truths are self-evident truths.
Right.
So there's a long lineage that follows the phrasing of John Locke that Thomas Jefferson was looking at when he talked about, for instance, the pursuit of happiness. He was talking about the right to achieve your highest aims, not the right, as people view it today, to sink to your lowest debauchery.
Right.
And so there's this understanding in that I really feel our generation needs to understand about the Declaration of Independence that really is powerful and can inform us today.
No doubt. Well, we talked about that inalienable right that probably had its source in Scripture.
Romans 1,
And,
yes.
And don't you think that, I don't know if Thomas Jefferson, Locke, do you think they actually referenced Romans 1 or both of them? Or do you think, where do you think that fits?
The Scottish Enlightenment philosophers were all theologians.
Okay.
They were all, several of them were pastors as well. They pastored at the same time.
And they would be contemporaries of Locke?
No, sir. So Locke was in the 1600s, late 1600s.
Okay.
These men are speaking in the early 1700s up through 1760.
I guess I'm trying to get the spiritual background of Locke. I've studied him before, but I didn't remember what his...
So Locke, so anyone in that culture in that day would have known the scriptures far better than many theologians today.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
Pardon me. Locke, though, was not necessarily a theologian. We don't know for sure where he stood on God, on some of these issues, but we do know that he was a very studious man and knew the scripture.
Well, I want to read Romans 1, and I'm going to start reading verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who, by their own unrighteousness, suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Wow. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Now, this is the inalienable right that they're seeing in it, is that God's attributes can be clearly seen because of what he's made.
Right.
So everybody, that's the common sense. It's a common,
and
everybody can see that.
Right, and that these truths are self-evident.
Yeah.
That they're baked into the fabric of the universe.
That's right. That everybody can observe it.
Right.
And say
Yes,
there's
sir.
something big out there that made these little bugs and those faraway stars and this big tree and whatever. They can observe that, and everybody can come to that conclusion.
Which means that no matter where you go, whether you're in Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, anywhere, North, South America, wherever you are, that no matter how remote you get into the hinterlands of those continents, you'll find that when you commit murder against someone, people recognize that even if it might be culturally permissible, there is still a scarring on the human soul when that happens. There is still something that is perceived as wrong. And so when you look at that, they're pointing out that with the Bible, what the Apostle Paul wrote all those years ago, that there are self-evident truths that supersede culture and they supersede location.
I think C.S. Lewis made this one famous, just that stealing. You know, if he has, wasn't it the orange or the apple that he talked about?
And then he talks about a kid's toy.
Yeah,
I love
and it's
it.
like everybody knows that that is wrong. So what makes it wrong?
Right.
You know, where do you know that that's wrong? It's like this common sense that I know that property or that thing belongs to you, and if I take it without telling you, that's stealing. And
that's right.
Every culture knows that.
Right.
And I would say your kids know that. I mean, 2-year-olds get that.
Exactly.
Mine, it's a strong sense.
You don't have to be educated into it. It's something baked into your
It's
person.
so true.
Yeah.
I like that term. It's kind of baked into our culture.
Yes, sir.
But so are the inalienable rights, the things that God has given us that we can clearly see. And among them are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That's
yes, sir.
Powerful words when you unpack those first few words.
Right. And so, yes, sir. And so when you look, John Adams wrote this to his wife, Abigail. By the way, David McCullough, in a great book on John Adams, he really talks about the relationship between John Adams and Abigail. That's a great book. I would recommend it. But anyway, he writes this. he said, the second day of July, 1776, and we'll get to why he wrote the second day, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I'm apt to believe it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the greatest anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God. Now look at his order of precedence. Solemn acts of devotion to God. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade and shows and games and sports and guns and bells and bonfires and illuminations, which is the old-fashioned word for fireworks,
Wow.
from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Now,
Wow.
this is a great thing. The second day of July, 1776. So mind you, it was the 10th of June when they formed the committee to go write this document, the Declaration of Independence. Okay. And they actually took Richard Henry Lee's resolution, and they actually decided to table the motion until they met again after a declaration had been formed.
Okay.
On the 2nd of July, they voted to affirm Richard Henry Lee's resolution. And then they submitted the Declaration of Independence, which people then signed, and then over the next couple of days is when people came in and signed their name. Now, mind you, it was a big thing. For instance, when John Hancock signed it in that big famous, signed his name so big and made the statement, we'll make sure that King George III can read this without his glasses, you know. They were basically signing their own death warrants.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a major thing that they did.
Pretty-
we celebrate the
pretty
4th.
bold.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We celebrate the 4th because that was the final signing of the Declaration.
Okay.
He pointed to the 2nd because that's when we actually decided we're going to be independent.
Got it.
But either way, whether we celebrate it on the 2nd or the 4th,
Gotcha.
it is memorable.
Well, that's why we're celebrating all week. We're just going to keep
I
going.
love it. I love it.
I want to, you brought up John Adams, and this is kind of where John Adams hits my wheelhouse, I guess, as a pastor.
Yeah. Great man.
And he says this, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Mm-hmm. It is wholly inadequate to govern for the government of any other.
Yes, sir.
And so this is my heart, is that, we've got to be, as a church, we've got to be not religious in a, how we would see religious. I think they're talking about religious as a God-fearing.
Right.
Wouldn't you say?
Yes, sir.
Whether
that's
they
true.
were all Christians or not, there's all that kind of debate out there, but I think many of them were. But I would say that they definitely feared God. And to your point, they knew Scripture probably better than most pastors today.
That's
they
true.
studied it. They knew it.
Yeah.
That this was like, whether they had a personal relationship with God or not, they knew that God created, and He's the Creator God, and He was to be feared, and they were going to give an answer to Him someday. Mm-hmm. That is a fear of God, and if you have a genuine fear of God, I believe you're going to make good decisions.
Yes, sir. Right.
And I think that's one thing that's lost. The other thing that's certainly lost is our morality. Mm-hmm. And, for us to bring up morality or to fight for morality, and I say fight for it because, it seems like us fight every time we mention morality.
Right.
It's like, well, all these exemptions. And it's like, well, but if morality fails and if our fear of God fails, then what he's basically saying, this Constitution isn't going to work.
That's right. Right.
And is it that simple? Is it those two things that we've lost? And is that why some of our constitutional traction has been lost? I
think so. And I think because what Adams was getting at there, that is only suitable for a moral and religious people. I've said this so often, I don't know where I first said it, but self-government, which is our form of government, self-government can only be upheld by people who will govern themselves.
Oh, that's so good.
And so when you think about that concept that I've just phrased, self-government can only be upheld by those who govern themselves. It's the same idea Adams is pointing out in that statement. Yeah. There's a man by the name of Os Guinness who, one of his books really changed my life at a pivotal point, but he calls it his golden triangle of freedom. And he says that liberty must be upheld by morality. And the reason is because of that same principle I just said about self-government and governing ourselves. Religion must be upheld by morality. But morality is not something that you just make up your mind you're going to be moral. It has to be rooted in faith. Yeah. And that's the third element of his golden triangle. And so when we talk about faith...
liberty, religion, and morality.
Yes, sir. That's right. Yeah. And so morality is important, but there are some people that try to do morality without an actual belief that they will give account someday for how they live their lives.
All right.
And as a result, whenever bad comes to worse and life grows extremely difficult, their morality is the first thing to go. And that's because they're answerable only to themselves. We're answerable to God.
Right.
And that is what our founders got, that liberty actually rests upon faith.
Yep.
Because faith is what gives us morality, truly.
Wow,
and I
that's
appreciated that
that's
from Os
really
Guinness.
good. Oh, that's excellent. Well, I think we've probably expanded our time as much as we possibly can today, and so I just so appreciate your knowledge of history and bringing us to this point of really trying to understand, trying to pass down to the next generation to say, listen, there's some bedrock things that came from these founders that we need to ponder. We need to not amuse ourselves. We need to think diligently on.
Yes,
So for the rest of this Liberty Week, I hope that you will ponder some of these things that we've been talking about today and ultimately go back to Scripture when it says we've got to be strong and very courageous. God bless you all.